Hello and welcome to the Game Theory Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Vestini. We're powered by CLNS Radio. Today on the show, we have a two-part podcast. The first part, we're going to get our off-season previews and off-season draft stuff rolling here for each individual team. The first guest here is Adam Mares from Denver Stiffs, the Locked On Nuggets podcast. We've had him on the show before. He's a great guest. Second guest, we're going to talk about the Atlanta Hawks. We are going to have on Brad Rowland to talk about that. So let's talk to Adam first. How are we going, buddy?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I am all right. It is a very nice Tuesday afternoon here in Los Angeles, California. How are things out in Denver?
We had a snowstorm over the weekend.
Seriously?
Yeah, I mean, it's been 80 degrees out here for 2 months, and then we got it happens every year that you get this like random, really late season snowstorm, and then it melts. So today we're back to 75-degree weather, but we had 2 days there where it was like, what's going on?
It is May, man. What is going on in Denver? I feel horrible.
I hate even saying that because there's this perception of Denver that it's like, Yukon, or the Northwest Territories or something like that, where it's actually pretty sunny and warm, but we do get this random storms a handful of times a year, and this just happened to be one of the later ones.
Oh, I lived in Denver for a summer, and it was the nicest, I think it rained once in the 3 months I was there. It was sunny every other day. I think that it's by some, people think it's like the sunniest city in the country, right?
Right, and the Nuggets even have on their floor 300 days of sunshine. Actually, it just says 300, but that's what it stands for. So that's kind of what it's known for.
Yeah, absolutely. Denver is a beautiful city. I just feel terrible for the fact that it snowed this weekend. Are we talking when you say storm? Are we talking a couple of inches, or what are we talking here?
Yeah, it wasn't so bad. It kind of stacked up. It's like the late season snow is like giant rain, basically. So the snowflakes are like the size of your fist, but it melts quick. So it sticks to the ground for a couple hours, and then the next, overnight, and then it's clear by sunrise.
Man, that is crazy. All right, let's get into this Nuggets stuff here. So I'm going to set the stage for you. The team went 40-42, ninth in the Western Conference, missed the playoffs by 1 game behind the Portland Trail Blazers. Fourth best offensive rating in the NBA at 113.2, 29th in defensive rating at 112.7. Those numbers will differ depending on where you get them. I got them from Basketball Reference. That gives them a net rating of a positive 0.5. That is something to grow on here. For the offseason, they have 2 free agents, I would say, that are important and worth noting. Danilo Gallinari has a player option for right around $16 million that he will almost assuredly decline. And then Mason Plumlee is a restricted free agent after being acquired in the Yusuf Nurkic trade earlier this February. They also gave up the Grizzlies' first-round pick, which ended up being number 20 overall in that trade, and they got a second-round pick in return. The team has picks number 13, that is its own draft pick, does not have its own second-rounder, but does have picks number 49 and number 51. The team can get to maximum cap space for a free agent if they dump Gallinari's $22.5 million cap hold. All right, Adam, what did I miss there? Fill in all of the context behind all of those numbers I just threw at our listeners.
Well, you said 2 important ones, but I guess that means the unimportant one is Mike Miller, who has a team option of $3.5 million. But you're right, that's not a very important one.
Hey, they have Roy Hibbert too.
Oh my gosh, you're right. I completely forgot because he was such a late season addition. But no, yeah, I think that's pretty much everything. That's the season in a nutshell, and the off season ahead of them, which could be. I think Nuggets fans have anticipated a shakeup of the roster for at least a season, if not 2. And every time you expect it, nothing ends up happening. Well, I think this is finally the year where I would be shocked if the Nuggets weren't involved in at least some kind of semi-major shakeup of the roster.
So, yeah, I think that the Nuggets have really 2 off seasons, right, to really get something going and to really build this roster. So they have this off season and then the next off season as well, right, when Nikola Jokic will have an exceedingly, startlingly low cap hold before moving up to max money. So
right,
it puts a clock on them, but they're not necessarily up against it. either, which puts them in a really interesting spot, especially when you consider the roster with all of these young players that are differing definitions of interesting, but will at least have trade value on the market if they decide to put them up there. Guys such as, Jamal Murray, Emmanuel Mudiay, Juancho Hernan-Gomez, Malik Beasley. I think those guys on some level should at least be discussed in trades, maybe Murray less than the other three. You've also got Will Barton as well, who has one more year left on his deal, who will assuredly come up in trade talks. Wilson Chandler, Kenneth Faried, both of whom are now in their late 20s, will also come up in trade talks, and Darrell Arthur as well, now that I think about it. So this is a really interesting team. Like Adam said, there's going to be a lot of fodder out there for discussions among teams that are looking to really improve their roster with a veteran, maybe continue a youth movement, or, the Nuggets, who may or may not be looking to make the playoffs next year. So where do you kind of put them in this whole grand scheme? I will let you, I'll cede the floor to you here.
Yeah, so I think that they're probably more in line with the continued development, more than trying to swing for the fence and push all the chips in just yet. They missed the playoffs this year. I think making the playoffs this year would have made things easier for them, because we're now on year 4 that Denver has not been in the playoffs. So I think fans are a little antsy, and just for ticket sales purposes, they kind of need to make the playoffs this next season. I think a failure to make the playoffs next season would probably put a lot of people on the hot seat in the coaching staff and front office. But so I think they're going to push for the playoffs, but I don't think they're going to, kind of go all in and try to make their move just now. I think it'll be more incremental progress. And then the other thing I would say, you kind of alluded to it earlier, is that my guess, and this is just my guess from outside, not something, from me talking to anybody, but my guess is that their preference would be to try to move up in this draft into one of those top 8 slots where you really have some of the high impact players. So my guess is, you talked about guys like Will Barton and Wilson Chandler. They also have a handful of draft picks, Malik Beasley. They have a lot of things, a lot of players and assets they can pair together to try to move up 4, 5, 6 spots. Which is always tough to do in a draft, especially in a draft with so many good players. But I think that would be the number one thing if I was trying to place bets. That would probably be my number one bet for the Nuggets.
I love the fact that you mentioned that. We're going to talk about that later on, because that is one of my favorite possible outcomes of this draft, is the Nuggets moving up and trying to get a forward, or, a 3-4 combo, maybe even like a defensive 5 kind of guy, even though it's a little bit finicky with Mason Plumlee there. You mentioned all of their future picks. The Nuggets do indeed, I should mention, have all of their own future picks in the first round. They have an even number of future second-round picks. I think that they owe 2 out, and they're owed 2 back in.
Right.
So, a full cache of picks here to make moves. They're in a really good spot to try and consolidate some of the talent on this roster, which I think was ultimately kind of the goal for Tim Connolly in the front office as they continued to build this thing.
Yeah, and the signing, you mentioned Darrell Arthur too, and I'm kind of curious what people around the league think of him. He had off-season knee surgery and was kind of limited this year. His contract at $8 million, I think, is pretty close to market value if he's healthy. Maybe even a little bit on the high side, but he's a guy that I wonder just where he fits into the roster.
Yeah.
Obviously, if they moved Kenneth Faried, then that would change things because the spot would open up. But he didn't play, even when healthy this year, he didn't play a whole lot. And part of that was just because the Nuggets were at their best when they went small. And then obviously Kenneth Faried ate up a lot of their regular type lineup. So he's another guy that you mentioned consolidation, and I think that's exactly one of the things they're going to have to do. Now, Danilo Gallinari might make that easier on them, because I have a feeling he's probably going to go elsewhere in free agency. But I still think there's room to kind of move some pieces around and consolidate to make the rotation a little bit easier on Coach Malone.
Yeah, Arthur's an interesting case, because if you think about it, the mid-level exception is moving up to right around the $8 million mark, if I remember correctly. And it would be pretty easy to see him getting a mid-level exception type deal in free agency, don't you think?
Again, it's all about the health. And that was what was so weird, is because they signed him to the deal, and then almost immediately he had surgery. So and I think kind of a surprise surgery. So it really depends on the health. My guess is he probably had a nice summer and will come back fully rehabbed and will be back to being a regular player. And if that's the case, then absolutely.
Yeah, I really like him as a player when he's on the floor. You know, he can knock down that mid-range jumper. He's a really instinctive, smart defender who can really do what Mike Malone wants him to do. So I like the idea of him. I like the idea of him, especially if Kenneth Faried moves on and finally takes his talents somewhere out of Denver, which it seems like we've been talking about for years and years now, and ultimately just still has never happened. Do
you know what Darrell Arthur shot from three this year?
Not off the top of my head. Do you?
Three attempts. Well, I pulled it up, but three attempts a game. So not per 36 or anything. That's per game on 15 minutes. He shot 45%.
I mean, if he's knocking down threes, he's like a $12 million a year player, especially when you consider the fact that, again, he's actually a really solid, smart defender who can guard fours and, you know, as the game downsizes, some fives, I think is fair to say. Yeah. But yeah, it's ultimately going to come down to the health, right? Like if he's healthy, he's a super valuable player. If he's not, you know, we'll see. But regardless, I do think that he is a positive net value on the trade market right now.
Yeah, I think so too, assuming health.
Yeah. So let's kind of get into the weeds here on Danilo Gallinari. Gallinari has a cap hold of around $22.5 million this year. Oh boy. So if you're trying to figure out what the Nuggets want to be in the future, it obviously revolves around Nikola Jokic. And I think that the two factors here are inextricably linked. Because Nikola Jokic, for all of the incredible talent he has offensively, the fact that he is probably, one of the three best offensive centers in the NBA right now, and he's only 22 years old or whatever. Like,
easily.
The fact that he's already there, you know, that's the kind of guy that you build around going forward. Gallinari, though, kind of plays into all of Jokic's weaknesses in a way, because he's not a great defender. He's at least smart and has gotten better on that end, but he's not going to be the kind of plus defender that you need to pair with Nikola Jokic, who still gets lost a little bit. You know, he's a really, really good team rebounder, but not necessarily a guy who's going to, you know, overwhelm you with 15 rebound games often. Right. You need a guy who's going to be physical, who's going to be able to protect the rim regularly on the weak side, and a guy who's going to be able to move laterally. And that's not really what Gallinari is at this stage of his career. So what do you kind of think about Gallinari and his fit on the Nuggets, and whether or not they should really consider looking to re-sign him?
It's the toughest question, I think, facing the Nuggets in a while, really, because I'm with you. I think Gallo's an incredible player, easily the second best player this last season on the Nuggets roster. And when you look at all of the best lineups, 5-man, 4-man, 3-man, whatever, Gallo was involved in almost all of them. Jokic and Gallo. I mean, you put those two together, and then it almost didn't matter what the other, you know, combination of players were. You get something good. And Gallo also, I think, one of the best things about him and Wilson Chandler together is the ability to play them as the 3-4 combo, and it doesn't really matter which one's the power forward and the small forward, but they're both so versatile. And Gallo, people don't realize this, Gallo's really tall. He's 6'10". He's almost as tall as Jokic, and you know, so he has the height to kind of, when you played Wilson Chandler, Danilo Gallinari, and Nikola Jokic together, one of those guys was going to get about 2 or 3 inch height difference, if not two of them. So I think that's one of the reasons the Nuggets offense was so potent, is you would always have a mismatch with one of those three guys just from the start. So I think the Nuggets would take a step back. I don't know that they would be able to replace Gallo. There's players out there, obviously, that are better than Gallo, like Gordon Hayward and players like that, but not players that I think the Nuggets have a realistic shot at. So I think they would take a step back at that position for a year, but at the same time, the break-even point comes after that, where in years 2, 3, 4, they're probably better off without him because the injury history and just kind of the direction of the team and needing to pay other players. So it's one of those things where you almost have to take one step back to take 2 steps forward. But if it were up to me and I was the one making the decision, barring Gallo taking a giant discount to stay in Denver, I think I would probably move on.
Yeah, so he's going to be 29 at the start of next season. That complicates factors, obviously. You know, it's worth mentioning, though, that last season was maybe his best year scoring the basketball, right? He averages 18 points a game on just an outrageous 62% true shooting percentage for a guy that shoots 5 threes a game. Like, the fact that someone could be that efficient is remarkable to me. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that he gets to the line and knocks down foul shots. He does create really, really efficient offense. But like, part of me just kind of believes that if you let him go, as long as you can move up and try and get your power forward of the future, at least this offseason, it makes sense to let him go.
Exactly. That's a perfect way of saying it. And a caveat to what you talked about, his career year, it's interesting that everybody on the Nuggets had career years this year. And I think a lot of that had to do with Nikola Jokic. And the big question is, I think Gallo is irreplaceable unless you're getting those top tier, Jimmy Butlers or somebody like that. I think he's irreplaceable at the small forward position for another role player. But at the same time, maybe he peaked a little bit this year like Wilson did. Wilson Chandler had a career year. Gary Harris, who's young, but he made such an enormous leap that it jumps off the page. Maybe that's just a product of the style of offense and kind of the greatness of Jokic. I'm not willing to – I think it's a scale. There's a percentage there. But I think a lot of it has to do with that, and I'm very curious. For example, if the Nuggets brought in someone like Andre Roberson, who's not a very good offensive player at all, if he suddenly becomes an average offensive player just because of the style of offense, that's a question that I don't know the answer to, but I think we're probably going to find out next year.
Yeah, so this conversation kind of dovetails into a really interesting idea of who do you consider the core of this team right now? So, like, who do you consider to be the building blocks that will be on the next Nuggets team to get to the second round of the playoffs, we will say? Not even necessarily make the playoffs, because I think that they can probably do that next year without any sort of, like, market improvement. But that next level, who do you think the guys are on this team right now that are going to be the building blocks that, were started 3-4 years ago that will continue to mature and grow and kind of lead the Nuggets to that next level?
I'll give you two that I think are guaranteed. Nikola Jokic, obviously, is kind of the foundation piece. And Jamal Murray would be the second one. We've only seen 1 year of him, but I just love Jamal Murray's game. And I also love... I just put this out on Twitter, actually, before we started recording, that I've talked about this before on Locked On Nuggets, but I really enjoy watching guys work out and just seeing their different style. And Jamal Murray's my favorite one. In 4 years of being credentialed, or 3.5 years, he's my favorite player to watch work out because he's so incredibly focused on the details every time he does anything. And he's a guy that I think next year is going to have a really, really, really big year. Now, we both share a mutual admiration for Gary Harris, who I would add to that list. If it were me personally, Jamal Murray would be the point guard and Gary Harris the shooting guard, and I would count that as kind of the core backcourt. But there is still a question about whether both of those guys, not if that they can coexist, but if Jamal Murray can actually play the point guard position. He's kind of, in my opinion, more of a natural two. But assuming that they can play together, then those three guys would be the core of the roster for me.
Yeah, so Jamal Murray this year, a 14% assist rate. That is pretty in line with what he was in college. More of a gunner at this stage than a natural lead ball handler. And that's fine. It's a very valuable player. I actually probably would say that I like Gary Harris more than I like Jamal Murray long term. I do understand that Murray probably has a higher ceiling, but guys like Gary Harris are so difficult to find, right? Guys that can, average something like 15 points a game on 61% true shooting, that are also not necessarily elite defenders, but he's a really strongly above average defender, I would say, who can defend 1 through 3 pretty easily.
He has the tools, I think, to be a great defender. It hasn't really translated, but again, everybody on the Nuggets roster has progressively gotten worse as a defender. So I suspect there's things going on there besides just him not being a good defender. I think he will be a very good defender at some point in his career, even if it hasn't translated yet. But yeah, it's funny with Gary Harris because one of the things that makes him great is he has all these skills, but he plays so within himself. And I think that's such a rare skill. And when you have somebody like Nikola Jokic, I think it's incredibly important to not force shots, because when Jokic is on the floor, the Nuggets will get a great look at some point in the shot clock if they're just patient. And Gary Harris is that guy that, hey, if I'm open, I'm shooting. If I'm not, I'm going to cut. And if none of that's open, I'm just going to keep the offense flowing, and that's so valuable. Jamal Murray, I think, has more talent off the dribble and can make tough shots. He's more of a basketball player, like his skill set is. But he also, I don't think he's reckless by any means, but he doesn't have the, Gary Harris's, I guess, poise in that. And just yet, it was his rookie season. This might change. But I just hope that both of them can play together, because even if they're neither one of them are traditional point guards, Nikola Jokic is a point guard. And you might not need – Jamal Murray might be able to develop enough point guard, calm the offense down when 2 or 3 possessions get hectic in a row. He might be able to develop just that, and that might be enough.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point. You bring up the idea of Gary Harris, too, being this guy that, really helps to just foster ball movement on the offense. I actually have a really good number for that. So when Gary Harris is on the floor, the Nuggets have a 64.8% assist rate. That's second on the team in terms of assist rate when they're on the floor for the entire team behind Nikola Jokic.
Wow.
I do think part of that is obviously that Harris played a ton of his minutes with Jokic this year, but I think it's also it goes to state that Harris is a guy that's not necessarily going to go out and try and really go crazy. He's going to play with efficient offense within the team concept, and that's a perfect fit next to Nikola Jokic.
And there's so many times, not just the Nuggets, but any team that has a good offense will get kind of a C+, B- shot in the first 5 or 6 seconds of a shot clock. And if a guy takes that, that's still a B- shot. And if you can keep working the ball, you might get a B or B+ or A- type look in another 5 or 6 seconds of offense. And I think that's a large part of it. And the other thing about that number is the assist rate goes up, not because he's a great passer, which he is, but because he's such a great cutter that passes open up to him. And he ends up finding himself so many times wide open under the basket. It's amazing that he's one of these great cutters in the league, and he still every game finds 2 or 3 layups a game off of wide open cuts.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point. He does. He's awesome in terms of off-ball movement as well. You kind of bring up all of these factors as to why I love Gary Harris and love watching him play. So let's move on to something that I love watching play a little bit less. Mason Plumlee. Mason Plumlee is going to have one of the more interesting restricted free agencies this summer, I think, because on one hand, he's going to be one of the more accomplished restricted free agents on the market, right? Because you can theoretically make an argument that he is more accomplished than Nerlens Noel, right? He was starting center on a really ridiculously good offensive basketball team, averaging something like 11 points, 8 rebounds, and 5 assists a game, which is really, really valuable.
And loved by every single one of his teammates and coaches. Yep. I mean, just an absolutely great locker room guy as well.
Yeah, no, that's also a really great point. And that was that way in Portland. And I've heard very similar things in Denver as well, even though he's only been there for 3 months now. So This brings up the question of how much is this guy worth to Denver versus how much he is going to get on the free market this summer. Because you can look around and you can say, okay, there are a lot of big men on this market this summer. There aren't really a ton of teams that need big men necessarily. But when you look at just what he's accomplished so far in his career, entering the market at 27 years old, it's pretty easy to see him getting $15 million a year. And I'm not sure that that's a number Denver should pay. So where do you kind of stand on Mason Plumlee and his fit so far in Denver?
I've changed my tune on it a little bit as time goes by, and it's kind of unfair to Mason because anytime you get traded to a new team, especially a team like the Denver Nuggets that had so many players in the rotation, I think it's really difficult to fit in. So I think he's better than what he showed while he was here in his 2 months here in Denver. The Nuggets brought him in and want to sign him long-term, I think, in part because they believe in playing him and Nikola Jokic together will work. I'm less confident about that, and because of that, the number keeps falling for me. So I started thinking, okay, maybe 15 million, 14 million, somewhere in that range. Then I was like, well, maybe 12 million. Now I think I'm down to, especially watching these playoffs, Nate Duncan and I were discussing this a couple weeks back, so many of these teams that have a good power forward and center combo or two centers, they end up completely scrapping it in the playoffs.
Yep.
Toronto being an example. And how much do you want to commit to something that might work during the regular season, but the league is moving away towards that? And that's where I think, okay, Mason Plumlee might actually be, for what he is to Denver, might actually be a $10 million a year type player, not a 12, 13, 14 million, which is probably what his market value is.
Yeah, the problem is that you have teams like Brooklyn, right, that just have money to burn in their wallets,
Yep.
and there's no reason for Brooklyn not to offer Mason Plumlee $15 million a year, right? Like,
if you're Brooklyn too, I think Mason Plumlee is the perfect guy for that type of system and for trying to develop the other players on your roster, because he's such a good screener, good passer. He's going to give those guys the best opportunity to succeed.
Right, and he's 27 years old. He's entering his prime. He's probably not going to be a part of your next winner, but you can at least see a circumstance where he helps your younger players mature, like you said, and become that next winner. So I never really bought the fit with Plumlee. You and I talked about this trade on this podcast whenever it went down, and I was pretty down on this trade for Denver when it happened. Yeah. And mostly it was for the reasons that played out, right? Like, Denver played 175 minutes this past season with Jokic and Plumlee on the floor together. They only had a +1 net rating whenever those guys were on the floor. Jokic, over the course of the entire season in his 2,000 minutes, had a +5.1 net rating. So I think that it's not a great fit to have those two guys playing together. And how valuable is Mason Plumlee for a team as a 20-minute per game, 15-minute per game backup center who probably plays less than that come playoff time? I'm not entirely sure. I don't really see the use of this for the Nuggets, but the problem is that I think it's going to be really difficult for them to sell, or Tim Connolly and for all of their front office to sell to ownership, hey, we traded Jusuf Nurkic, who's now balling out in Portland, and the number 20 overall pick for a guy that we're going to let go in restricted free agency.
That's the toughest part, and honestly, whatever happens, I think that'll be the biggest media narrative is, they signed him because they had to save face, or, they lost him and now what a disaster that trade was. I think, for me personally, I got it wrong too, and you mentioned that you were on the right side of this when the trade happened, is I liked it because I liked the idea of, now you can have a passing center on the court at all times. Yeah. They only have to overlap a bit. It made sense to me, but it so far hasn't played out that way, and I think mostly because of how well Jusuf Nurkic has played. That's the bigger part of this. But
he was never – the thing is, though, is like that's going to be the media narrative, and I know that I just kind of spouted it. Nurkic was never going to play this well in Denver, right? Like that's just a reality of the situation. And it artificially stunted his trade market because of it. Having said that, it's still going to look bad if they let Mason Plumlee go because they essentially gave up the 20th overall pick for nothing.
Yeah, and it will be, I think, a decision that has ripple effects for years to come, whatever it is. I do think there is a price where it's pretty risk-free, and that price is probably in the $10 to $12 million range, because I do think Mason Plumlee is one of the 30 best centers in the league.
I agree.
So even if he's coming off the bench and you have him at a below-market starting center price, which would be like the 10 to 12 million range, then I think some team down the road, a year or 2 years from now, when you have to start paying some of these other guys, you could probably trade him, and he's a starter, a 29-year-old starter now, and you can kind of get under that deal, because the Nuggets have money to spend this year. They're not going to they might not get back to the salary floor. So whatever they pay him probably won't hurt him this year. It might not hurt him next year. So maybe that's the risk the Nuggets are willing to take in an overpay, thinking they can move him in a couple years.
Yeah. I mean, if it's an overpay, I think they're going to struggle to move him because there's just so many overpaid centers out there right now. But if they can get him at $12 million a year, I think that's a movable contract.
Right. Yeah,
so
exactly.
It's going to depend on just where he falls in line and who ends up offering him considerable amounts of money. Last thing here before I let you go, Adam, let's do some draft preview prep. What prospects interest you in this 2017 NBA draft?
Well, realistic ones for the Nuggets. Obviously, I'm a big Lonzo Ball guy, and I enjoy that. I kind of enjoy the chaos that has happened around him in terms of everybody. I mean, his value has somehow tanked amongst basketball analysts, I feel, over the last couple weeks, months. but I enjoy him. But realistic choices for the Nuggets, Jonathan Isaac is the guy that, and when I mentioned trading up, he's the guy that I'm thinking about there, because I really, really like his game. I think he's a guy I would actually bet on to become a very good basketball player. Of course, depending on where he lands, because he does have a skill set that if you try to make him into this, like, give him the ball and clear out the way player, I don't think he will succeed. But I do love his skill set, especially with Denver. I think defensively he has the length that he could grow into this great power forward guy that comes and erases some of Jokic's shortcomings. And then offensively, I just kind of like his kind of all-around game and fluidity and all of these things. So he's a guy, when I mentioned the Nuggets have the 13th pick, I think most mocks have him going somewhere in the 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 range. Most people right in the middle there, around 8. Where's he at in your latest big board, actually?
So, yeah, I'm a big Jonathan Isaac fan. I think I've been like driving the train for him being a really, really strong prospect. I have him at number 5 on my board right now. I think that he is going to be an awesome defensive basketball player, and he would be the absolute perfect fit next to Nikola Jokic, because he has really great defensive rebounding instincts, really great rim protection instincts, has a nose for the basketball. Plus, he's also one of the best lateral movers at 6'10", 6'11", with a 9-foot plus standing reach that I've gotten a chance to see recently, at least. I mean, he's just that talented, that skilled.
I thought you were going to say in this draft, and I'm glad you said that you've seen recently, because that's how I feel too. It's not just that he moves well relative to your average draftee. I think he moves well for anybody we've seen at his height defensively. Yeah. He's just so smooth. To me, I'm with you. I love that you have him 5th, because he's the guy, kind of like Jaylen Brown last year, where every mock had him 7th, and then all of a sudden he goes 3. I think Isaac's the guy that every mock will have him, 7, 8, 9, and he'll end up going 4th or 5th, or he'll be the guy that jumps really, really late, because I just think the upside with him is so high.
Yeah, I mean, we saw it with a guy last year in Thon Maker, too, where a team really valued mobility from the center position. And I think that's a really big reason why he ends up going 10th overall to the Bucks last year. I think that if the Nuggets want him, they're going to have to move up into that number 6 overall range. So,
is that possible, by the way?
That's what I was going to ask you. I guess the question is, what do you think is worth moving to try and move up to that number 6 spot? So, or like let's say number 6, because I think Orlando's an interesting trade partner for a lot of reasons, because, they need a point guard. The Nuggets have multiple point guards. They need, help on the wing. You could even look at a Malik Beasley or a Juancho or something like that to move. They need shooting. Again, Juancho, Beasley, guys like that can really help them. So let's kind of talk about number 6 here. What are you, as a Nuggets fan, a Nuggets analyst, what are you considering on the table to move up from number 13 to number 6?
This is such a fun question for me, and number 6 is so interesting. Obviously, if Isaac is on the board, I don't think I would do this for a Zach Collins or any of those other players. It's specifically Jonathan Isaac being available because I really like his game. And here's where I go. We know from that leaked photo that Orlando is interested in Juancho Hernangomez, and they're interested in Wilson Chandler. So I would start with Wilson Chandler, who I love, but I think he's gone this year, whether he's traded or becomes a free agent. I think this will be his last year in Denver. So that's already kind of a sunk cost. Malik Beasley is another guy I would be very okay with moving, because he's so buried on the depth chart right now. And he has some upside, but I'm a little bit less sold on him. So Wilson, Beasley, and the 13th pick would be my initial offer. I don't know if Orlando takes that deal. I think they were going to want Juancho Hernangomez, who I actually think is an absolute stud. I think Juancho Hernangomez is really, really good. The problem is, if Jamal Murray and Jokic and Gary Harris, are your three core guys, I think Jonathan Isaac probably fits a little bit better than Juancho Hernangomez. So those would be the 4 pieces I would be willing to part with. You're probably parting with 2 or 3 of them, not all 4. And I would strongly hope that's not Juancho, but my suspicion is that would be kind of the hang-up.
So I kind of waited to talk about this guy until we got to this point in the podcast, but where does Emmanuel Mudiay fit into all of this? Because I think that he makes a lot of sense as a potential sweetener in a trade, even though he's had a rough first 2 years. I'm someone who still believes in his game. I had him at number 3 on my draft board the year that he was selected. And I like what I've seen when he's played with Jokic. I think that those two kind of accentuate each other really, really well. But I'm also realistic in that I think I probably overrated his athleticism coming into the NBA.
To me, I would have no problem moving him, and it stinks. It's tough for a point guard because, like you said, point guards, they could not get it, and then one day they get it. And with Moody, I wrote an article not too long ago saying why the Nuggets shouldn't give up on him, and I do think that there's a lot of skills he has that are worth exploring. But if the deal was Wilson Chandler, Malik Beasley, and Emmanuel Mudiay, I wouldn't even think twice. I wouldn't even have to consult with anybody. I would make the deal right then and there because the odds are Jamal Murray is going to be they're going to try this Jamal Murray at point guard all year next year. And Mudiay is going to be the backup. And if they can't move Jameer Nelson, maybe he's the third string again like he finished this year. So I would be more than fine with moving on from Emmanuel Mudiay in a deal like that, especially for a guy like Jonathan Isaac, who I'm incredibly high on, and especially if that meant you kept Juancho Hernangomez. The other thing that's cool about a deal like that, the Nuggets would have 5 guys. You never know if all 5 of them are going to hit, but they would have a guy at every position. Jamal Murray at the 1, Gary Harris at the 2, Juancho Hernangomez at the 3, Jonathan Isaac at the 4, Nikola Jokic at the 5. That's your core, and it kind of lines up very nicely. So if that happened, I would be okay with it.
Yeah, I think that that's a really interesting idea, and I think that it's worth mentioning, too, the news that came out today that John Hammond is going to end up moving from, general manager of the Milwaukee Bucks down to Orlando, and I can see him putting a bit of a premium on Emmanuel Mudiay because, traditionally the Bucks have put a strong emphasis on having positional size and typically athleticism, which Mudiay, I think we've seen, doesn't necessarily have yet. Having said that, though, I think that he is someone at 6'5" with like a 6'8" wingspan that could interest Hammond at least.
You're giving me hope now for this deal because it's such a great deal in my opinion, for the Nuggets. Because again, Malik Beasley's kind of a sunk cost in my opinion. He's just too deep on the depth chart, even going into next season, unless they move Barton. So I to me, and Wilson Chandler, I think, has a foot out the door already. I just think that's a phenomenal deal for Denver if they could get it done. And it makes some sense to me on Orlando's side. I don't think it's a horrible deal for them because they do get 2 young prospects in Beasley and Mudiay. They get another draft pick in 13, and then Wilson Chandler kind of helps them 1 year. Wilson Chandler is a phenomenal Swiss Army knife type player. He'd help them at least for 1 year to kind of steady the ship.
Yeah, I think that that's a really interesting idea, and I'm sure that Frank Vogel would like having a veteran like Wilson Chandler around too.
Yeah, for sure. Let's make it happen, Sam. Let's place the call for me, will you?
Yeah. I mean, number 5 is an interesting fit too. I mean, the Kings could also use a point guard like an Emmanuel Mudiay, trying to find some wings like a Juancho, like a Malik Beasley behind Buddy Hield. Like there are fits in the lottery that I think make a lot of sense for the Nuggets to try and explore moving up. But the problem is, I think that they probably have to either get above 7 or get to a point where 7, Tom Thibodeau is willing to move on from 7 for veterans, right? So, I'm sure Tom Thibodeau would have a lot more interest in Wilson Chandler for a year than, say, the Sacramento Kings, who are undergoing a youth movement, would, right? So, you could look at, Malik Beasley, Wilson Chandler, and 13, and then maybe something else for number 7 if Isaac falls there.
And those are the type of deals you have some talks with in the days leading up to the draft, and then you don't pull the trigger till that moment.
Right?
Yeah, that's because you kind of want to make sure he's still around. Right. I'm with you, though. I think he's going to be the guy this year that, he's 8th, and then the next week, he's 7th. He's going to go 6th, then he ends up going 5. So I'm a little concerned for that. Yeah,
no, that's a really, really good point. Let's talk about guys at 13 that interest you maybe. Like OG Anunoby is a guy that's been connected with Denver basically since they knew that they were not going to be in the playoffs, really the entire draft season, just because of his interesting skill set. Have you watched any Anunoby tape?
I've watched the highlight videos and the Draft Express videos. I haven't watched an actual full game of him, but
This is the YouTube big board, as Spike Eskin calls it, over on the Right Sturkey Sanchez.
Okay, yeah. I think he's phenomenal. I really have fallen in love with his game. The injury stuff concerns me, and there's a part of me that thinks, okay, he misses summer league, maybe he misses the first month or two in training camp, and that means he's going to have a tough rookie season where he's not playing a lot, and that could complicate things. But I do like just his upside and how the idea of him, I think, is really, really great in Denver.
The interesting aspect of his game to me, obviously, is the defense. I think he has as much defensive upside as anyone in this draft. He's 6'7" with a 7'2" wingspan, just in ridiculous physical condition. Really can switch 1 through 5. Freak athlete, can protect the weak side of the rim. I think he's also probably the worst offensive player in this first round projected area right now. But even with that said, you've written before, and this is something that I've kind of piggybacked off of you and given you credit for on this podcast even, is that I like the idea of Anunoby in that short corner role that Kenneth Faried has played so well for the Nuggets really over the course of the last year.
And that's the thing I would have to watch actual game footage, because highlights, the thing that makes Kenneth Faried so good at that is not just his athleticism, all those things obviously help, but it's just he has this very good instinct for staying out of the way. And playing that short corner, that's kind of what you have to do. It's hey, don't clog this guy's space. Don't clog, this is what's about to happen. I got to go over here so I'm far away and drag my defender with me. And you kind of have to watch the game to see those, because highlight, that doesn't always translate to a highlight package. So I don't know about him in that regard, but if he's as athletic and mobile and long as everybody says, I imagine it's something he should be able to learn.
Yeah, no, that's kind of where I'm at with the Nuggets draft pick. They should be looking for a big, mobile, maybe physical forward who defends and can play next to Nikola Jokic. And those guys are really difficult to find, obviously. Yeah. Another guy that interests me for them is Jawan Evans, just as a guy who's a killer pick-and-roll player who can get his own bucket there. He would be just an incredible, off-the-bench spark plug for them going forward, I think.
I don't really know a whole lot about him.
Yeah, he's like a 5'11", really ridiculous scorer. He was I think he had the most points in the pick and roll of any high major point guard this year in all of college basketball. Really efficient in those looks, just lightning quick, can get separation whenever he wants. He'd be a really good transition player for them. And the fact that he can score would make him kind of a good running mate for Nikola Jokic. Ultimately, I don't know that he's necessarily a long-term starter, but whenever you have Jamal Murray and you have Gary Harris and you have all of these big guards, I think you can afford to take a chance on a smaller guard if all of those bigger forwards and your bigger needs are gone.
Can you imagine the Nuggets using their first pick 3 years in a row on a point guard? I mean, there's almost a little humor to that. I think that would be, for Nuggets fans, I think it would be tough to accept. But, if he's the best player and it fits, then you have to do it. Let me ask you though with OG, because he's another guy that I see all over draft boards. What are the chances, not necessarily where you have him, but what are the chances that he moves up ahead of 13 in the draft?
I think that there is a chance. I think there's a pretty solid top 10 right now, all the way down to the area where you have guys like Frank Ntilikina, Lauri Markkanen, Malik Monk is down there at 8 for me. Those guys in the top 10 I think are pretty set. Number 11, I have Zach Collins, and I'm pretty solid there, but I can see teams, valuing fit over best available player and thinking that, OG Anunoby fits at number 11. Number 12, I think Anunoby makes sense. I think Detroit has that pick as well. 11, I think, is Charlotte. Anunoby makes a little bit of sense for Charlotte. The key is that Charlotte has Michael Kidd-Gilchrist, and Anunoby's kind of a carbon copy of Kidd-Gilchrist. Yeah. And then 12, Detroit. I think Detroit, has a lot of these combo forwards, right, with Marcus Morris and Tobias Harris. And, I think they even have one more off the top of my head that I can't think of right now. But they have those kind of player types. Maybe they just value Anunoby just from best player available perspective. But I think there's a decent chance that he is there at 13. And ultimately, it's really because, again, he really just hasn't shown me anything in terms of game offensively. He was a good shooter on limited attempts as a freshman. That regressed his sophomore year. Really low release point, but a fluid, workable mechanical shot at least. You can see him shooting 35%, 36% from three at some point if he gets the right development. I'm I'm lower on him than I feel like some people are, but I understand the appeal nonetheless.
Gotcha. But we'll see. I think the Nuggets will be trying to trade that pick, will be my guess. But
yeah.
But if OG is there and the Nuggets take him, I think Nuggets fans would still be very excited about that. So there's kind of some nice options there for intrigue for the Nuggets.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to make you give me one bold offseason prediction before we go, Adam. What is your bold offseason prediction for the Denver Nuggets?
Man, it's got to be bold, huh? Because saying like Gallo not re-signing, that's not really that bold to me. I think there's a pretty good chance of it. I've been saying I think the Nuggets are going to pursue some big time free agents. I actually think they will. There will be some names that pop up like Blake Griffin, and the Nuggets are having a meeting, with guys of that nature. But if I'm going to go bold, here's my bold one that I don't even know if I actually believe. I think Emmanuel Mudiay will be traded.
I'm good with that. I think that is a bold prediction whenever you're talking about number 7 overall pick, I believe, 2 years ago. I mean, anytime you're giving up on a top 10 pick after 2 years, that's pretty bold to try and, predict that out. And I agree with you on free agent meetings as well. I think that they're going to go after guys like Griffin, Paul Millsap, guys of that ilk that really make sense for them in the short term.
Yeah, absolutely. And their names might even pop up in some trade rumors, once again for some big names like Jimmy Butler or something. I don't think they'll progress very far, but I think they'll be one of the teams where people say, oh, that's interesting. Denver's in the mix, huh?
Yeah.
But I think if I go bold, and I would say, I would bet less than 50% chance of it happening, but I do think Emmanuel Mudiay, just the fact that they benched him and cut him completely out of the rotation, that to me, that there's more to it than just that. I don't think they've given up on him, but I think they would probably place some phone calls, and there's a good chance that he's, like you said, a part of some type of trade package to move up.
Yeah, I agree with you. The Nuggets are going to have one of the most interesting off seasons in all of the NBA, in my opinion. That's why we ended up going along with Adam Mares. Typically, these are going to be about 30 minutes, but I ended up keeping Adam for 45. Thank you, Adam, for coming on. I really appreciate it. Tell the people where they can find your work and what you have coming soon.
Well, thanks so much for having me on. I always love talking Nuggets and the NBA with you and the draft. But you can find my work on Twitter at Adam_Mares, M-A-R-E-S. And then you can follow Denver Stiffs. Check out our site there. We do a really, really good job of covering the Nuggets on that side. I'm pretty proud of it.
Yeah, you guys should be. I love what you guys have done, taking over from my good buddy Nate Timmons, who I used to see out in Denver when I lived out there for that summer. I'm really glad that the site has continued to mature and blossom even without his stead. So, Adam, thank you for coming on. The next segment, you're going to hear me with Brad Rowland from over at Uproxx Sports. All right, we are back with the second part of this episode here to break down the Atlanta Hawks offseason and NBA draft situation. To do that, I've got Brad Rowland here from over at Uproxx Sports and Locked on Hawks. How's it going, Brad?
I'm good, Sam. It's a pleasure to be here, my friend. I'm a big fan of the podcast, so it's nice to be here.
Oh, I appreciate that. It's always very nice to, have someone on who, kind of knows how I operate here with just like slanderous cursing and all of the craziness. So let's break down the Hawks just to set the stage here for how their season went in 2016-17 for those that hopefully did not watch the Hawks much this year. They went 43-39, made the playoffs, and lost Washington in round 1 in 6 games. However, they had the 27th best offense in the NBA at a 104.9 rating per 100 possessions. 4th in defense, 105.8. Still, that is a negative 0.9 net rating despite a winning record. That's kind of a perfect encapsulation, I feel like, of what the Hawks were this year, right?
Yeah, that's about right. They were largely unwatchable offensively. Yes. Defensively, they were good, even if not dominant. Pretty good on the whole. When you have Dwight Howard and Paul Millsap, that can help things. But yeah, it was not exactly a pleasing product to cover on a daily basis. So you can imagine my plight there. But hopefully things will change in the future. But this last year was not the most fun I've ever had.
No, this last year I would imagine was just super frustrating and infuriating at points. And let's kind of get into the weeds here in terms of what their free agent situation looks like, in terms of what they're going to have set in store this offseason. So they have, Paul Millsap's situation to deal with. Obviously, it was reported, I think, officially today. Finally, it was obvious before, but he is going to opt out of that last player option deal in his contract. This is very obvious for him. It is a situation where it's really his last chance to cash in like crazy. I mean, if he got 4 years, $125 million or whatever his max is, it would not really surprise anyone, right?
No, not at all. I mean, as you mentioned, he's 32 years old now. The Hawks can give him the 5-year max, which would be a crazy number, like a 5-year, $205 million number that I can't imagine that they want to do. But they could pay him the most. And if you're Paul, he's taking a discount on his last 2 contracts. The first one when he signed with the Hawks was sort of the Danny Ferry special. It was like 2 years and $19 million. Yeah. And then the last time when he was in sort of a bidding war between the Hawks and the Magic, he still took less than the max. So I think Paul is probably going to be ready to cash in here and definitely going to be getting a 9-figure total salary even at his age.
Yeah, and it's well deserved. I mean, Millsap for me has been one of my like super under the radar like treats to watch every day that he's been in Atlanta. Like, he is so solid defensively, probably a top 5 or 6 defender in the entire NBA. A very solid offensive game where he has really developed the ability to create off the dribble as well as shoot. Because if you remember when Millsap came into the league, he was this big 6'8", 6'7", burly, 250-pound rebounder who people wondered how he would be able to match up defensively with guys and if he could expand his game beyond like the 8-foot range. And his development over the last, decade has just been unbelievable. He has added more to his game, I feel like, than any player that I can really remember in covering the NBA draft and the NBA as a whole.
Yeah, he's changed a whole lot. Just for some reference, he never attempted even 43s in a season with the Jazz, and in all 4 years with the Hawks, he's attempted at least 200 threes. So he's just, it's not just that either, as you mentioned. Like, he does a lot of different things well. He's obviously an awesome defensive player, but he's a really good passer. He can basically do anything you want him to do, and it's almost a shame that he didn't add this stuff until later on, because I would like to see Paul at his full athleticism be able to do this. Like when he was 26, 27, maybe if he was this player, it would have been a lot of fun. But yeah, he's a tremendous player. It's not going to be his fault when he gets overpaid this summer, because that's what's going to happen. I mean, it's going to most guys when they're in their mid 30s, not in the LeBron division, starting to slow down, and Millsap's probably going to do that. But he's definitely earned the big time payday with being a tremendous player.
Yeah. So just for reference here, Brad mentioned how many 3-pointers Millsap had taken in a season before he got to Atlanta. In his 3 years at Louisiana Tech, he took 16 3-pointers, the entire 92-game sample that he was there. It really is, just an unbelievable story that he is where he is right now. All right, so let's move on to the other free agents here that are of note. Ersan Ilyasova, Chris Humphries, Thabo Sefolosha, Mike Muscala, and Tim Hardaway Jr. is a restricted free agent. I also missed Mike Dunleavy in there, assuming that the Hawks decide to, what is it? It's like a non-guarantee for $5 million or something, right?
Yeah, he's actually guaranteed for a little bit over $1 million. I can't imagine they're going to pay all of it. So if they were to part ways with him, they're going to owe him I think it's $1.2 million, somewhere in there.
Yeah, so I would think that they probably part ways with Dunleavy, at least at that price. But the most important one, I think, is Tim Hardaway Jr. of that group. But we'll get to him in a minute, because I feel like even, and also, I'm sorry, to set the stage for the rest of their offseason, the Hawks also have pick 19 in the NBA draft, as well as 31 and number 60 from Golden State. So they have 3 picks coming up here. The 19 and number 31, both those picks are going to be really, really good picks in what is shaping up to be a relatively deep draft. We'll get to that again at the end of the podcast, just like we did with Adam. But before we get to any of the player movement, any potential additions, I think that we have to start with the upheaval that is happening right now in the front office for the Atlanta Hawks, because Wes Wilcox is out, obviously. It seems like Mike Budenholzer is going to take a step back in terms of what his responsibilities are in terms of basketball operations. So they're basically kind of going in fresh here, it seems like, and they're going to be hiring someone new to take over this entire situation.
Yeah, it's very, very odd in that both Wilcox and Budenholzer are still around. Obviously, Bud is going to just be the head coach now, and that's something that he's definitely good at. Sort of the jury was still out as to whether Budenholzer was going to be a great number one guy in the front office because he was doing the dual role there for a while. But it's very strange that they're both still around and they're going to hire over them, essentially. But, it's very interesting to see who they're going to bring in just because of that dynamic that's already there, as well as the fact that, you're into a pretty big offseason with the fact that, Millsap's a free agent, as we talked about, with 2 draft picks, but they're running the show with a couple of assistant GM types. Jeff Peterson's around. The former general manager Rick Sund has been sort of in charge at the moment. But yeah, I think they're going to have to hire someone as soon as possible here. It's starting to worry me a little bit that they're going to get deep into this draft season and not have anybody in place. But at least they're taking the measured approach here, try to get their guy. But there's a lot of uncertainty as to what it's going to look like, just because of the fact that you have a lot of cooks in the kitchen already, and you're going to add another one.
See, it's just such a weird thing, though, for the Hawks, too, right? Because, I guess for me, over the last decade, because they've made the playoffs in each of the last 10 years, which is kind of crazy to think about, given this organization and, how, I don't want to say, moribund it's been, but it's just been relatively excitementless, almost, other than the 60-win year. I guess that... status quo has been the modus operandi for them. They never have torn it down. They always just kind of keep it together. This offseason, though, seems very different in that regard, just by the fact that Paul Millsap is going to be gone in all likelihood, I would think. I mean, unless Atlanta and the new general manager decides, and really ownership, I guess, at the top decides, they just need to compete and need to try and make the playoffs next year. I would imagine Paul Millsap's going to be gone. We're going to be getting an entirely new front office, which means it's not status quo, finally, for the first time in what feels like a decade. So what is kind of your temperature on just finally changing things? Because I would imagine just making things slightly different has to be appealing to a certain part of the fan base of Atlanta.
It would certainly be appealing to me, just because of the fact that I think they've been stuck in this mire. And it's impressive on one hand to make the playoffs 10 years in a row. They had the longest playoff streak in the Eastern Conference and the second longest one to the Spurs in the entire league. So there's something to be said for that. But I'm actually not as convinced as you are that they're going to be able to go away and actually get away from the status quo. There's been some quotes from the ownership that basically said that they want to, they made Millsap the number one priority, all these things, and it seems like they don't want to rebuild. Whether that means Millsap stays or not, it's kind of up to him because he's unrestricted. He can do whatever he wants. Maybe he sees, a rainbow somewhere else that he wants to follow, but I'm not as convinced that it's going to happen. I'm hoping that it does, just because, I love Paul Millsap, but bogging yourself down with that rather than going a little bit, younger and perhaps more future facing would be something that I would not be on board necessarily with going ahead and doing that. But I don't know. For me, it's all about the GM hire. First and foremost, if the GM is given this mandate by ownership to say, we want you to win right away, I would not love that. I'd like to have, you hire a guy and kind of let him do what he wants to do. But there are some rumblings that the ownership group is not really interested in rebuilding. And I think we saw that at the trade deadline, where a lot of people, including myself, were arguing that the Hawks should go ahead and maybe try to market Paul Millsap and maybe look to the future a little bit, because they were, as we talked about at the beginning of this thing, not very good this season, but they wanted to make the playoffs. They did that. They lost in the first round, and kind of that's what we all thought would happen. I'm just not convinced entirely that they're willing to rebuild, even if that's probably the easiest way and the best way to moving forward.
Yeah, no, I strongly would have agreed with you. I think that they absolutely should have gotten what they could have for Paul Millsap. I mean, how close is this team to competing for a title? And this kind of this dovetails nicely with what I want to talk about next. I mean, who are the pieces that you're building around in Atlanta right now? I mean, Dwight Howard you have for 2 more years, but obviously going to be on the wrong side of 30 here. And, I think we saw some waning playoff results, at least, that have to be concerning, even though I think he was pretty underrated throughout the course of the regular season. Kent Bazemore is going to be around for what seems like 3 years guaranteed, given the fact that he is on this massive contract that's going to pay him, 17, 18, and 19 million over the course of the next 3 years after just not a great year, we will say, for Kent Bazemore, and put it kindly. Dennis Schroeder is going to be around for 4 more years. He at least took a step forward in a nice way, but who knows what we think of him going forward. Taurean Prince was one of my favorite rookies this year. I really liked what he brought, but again, going to be 24 next year, I believe, if he's not already 24. So there's a limited upside there, even for a rookie. DeAndre Bembry was at least okay at times, I thought, but there's not a player out of that group that gets you super excited as a building block. Like, I don't really think anyone of those guys is untradeable. You know what I mean? And that makes me wonder kind of where is this franchise going? Where is the core that you're trying to build around?
Yeah, those are questions that I'm also asking, basically every day. And a couple of those guys I like, Taurean Prince is a guy I'm really high on as well. But as you mentioned, he's already 23 years old. And, I think he has a pretty good future in the NBA, but not a star future. I don't really think there's that guy on the roster even close to being that guy on the roster that you're going to build around. Your best player is Paul Millsap by far. But as we talked about at the beginning, he's 32 years old. That's sort of the place where they're at right now, where it's kind of frustrating in both directions, and that they don't necessarily want to rebuild and look to the future. But if they continue to do what they're doing now, it's sort of has a ceiling that's pretty firm. The 60-win season was a lot of fun, but that was a team that was also responsibly constructed. There are a lot of short-term contracts, a lot of value contracts, and on the team right now, you don't really have that. Dwight's appropriately paid, if anything. Paul's about to be overpaid if he comes back. You have guys like Schroeder, who's as you mentioned, took a step forward, but now has an extension kicking in where he's going to suddenly be making $15-16 million a year, and he won't be underpaid anymore. So there's just not really that asset. You have some nice draft capital, a couple of future picks coming, but aside from that, there's not a ton of things to be excited about moving forward, which is another reason why I would be trying to get up, maybe not necessarily in this draft, but maybe look to rebuild and not necessarily full on tank, but at least look to the future in a way that they just haven't been doing recently.
Yeah, Dennis Schroeder averaged 18 and 6 this year. Took a nice step forward in terms of efficiency scoring the basketball. Was better, I felt, in terms of some of the wild aspects of his game, where it seemed like he would gamble a little bit less defensively, was slightly less turnover prone, but there's still a lot of, I guess we'll call it room for growth in Dennis's game, where you wonder if he'll ever really come together in the way that his skill set kind of makes you think that he could eventually.
Yeah, I think his numbers don't really. I mean, I don't know. It's interesting to say. I don't want to kill Dennis, because I think he was pretty good, as I mentioned before. But I don't think he was as good as his numbers, the 18 and 6, would indicate. He was asked to do a whole lot this year, just because of the lack of options and sort of the way that he had the ball in his hands quite a bit. Pretty high usage guy, and he can definitely score. But it's sort of a one-trick pony right now. He really just uses his speed, and he's definitely improved as a shooter, but he's not exactly a dynamic guy either. And also his defense this year as a full-time guy, not surprisingly, took a step back just because he's playing full-time minutes for the first time. But I don't think he's anything more than maybe an average starter at the top end. He's not even there yet, in my opinion. He's probably somewhere in the 20-25 range, somewhere in there at this point. And maybe he can improve, but I'd be stunned if he ever became a top 10 point guard in the league. So, I mean, if he's your best asset or one of your two best assets, it's fine if he's your starter, I think, moving forward, but he's not exactly one of those guys where you're banking on some massive return either.
Yeah, I think I agree with you fully there. So let's kind of talk about the free agency aspect here. Tim Hardaway Jr. is a restricted free agent. Oh boy, I would be terrified about this upcoming contract for Tim Hardaway if I was any organization. Before I say how much I think he is going to get paid, I will ask you, how much would you pay him if you were the Atlanta Hawks incoming general manager?
Hawks fans have been really on me all year because I'm very low on Tim. It sounds like you are as well. I've never been a big fan. I will say he's improved quite a bit, and he's now officially playable. He's a rotation guy, and that's something that I wasn't sure he was ever going to be. So props to him for that. But with that out of the way, I wouldn't touch an 8-figure per year contract for Tim Hardaway Jr., but I think he might get that and probably will get that. So I would not be willing to match anything north of maybe $8 or $9 million a year, and I think he's going to get more than that. So I think for me, if I'm the GM, I'm letting Tim go pretty much, unless something crazy happens. But I'm sure I'm in the minority when it comes to Hawks fans and maybe even some people in the league.
Oh yeah, I think he's getting like $460 or like $465.
And that would be. I would go running and screaming away from that contract. There's just no way I would even consider matching that deal. Maybe I know I'm low on Tim, but I just think he's more of a. I don't think he's a starter moving forward. I think he's more of a seventh man type of offensive spark plug kind of guy, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. But you don't want to pay that guy that. And I understand that he had his best season this year, and he's still relatively young. He's 25 years old. But I want no part of that deal.
I mean, Alan Crabb just got an $18 million offer sheet from $18 million per year offer sheet from Brooklyn. And I think Tim is just clearly a more dynamic player than Crabbe. Like if I was Brooklyn, I would much rather pay Tim Hardaway $18 million a year than Allen Crabbe, just because Crabbe is definitely a better shooter, but he doesn't attack closeouts as well as Hardaway does. Hardaway is a better passer, maybe a more inattentive defender at times, but I don't think there's like a super big difference in the way that they defend either. Like you said, Hardaway coming off of his best season as a pro, 57% true shooting percentage on 14 points a game, 3 rebounds, 2 assists per game as well. I don't see a way that he gets under like 456. So that would be $14 million a year on average. And yeah, if I was the Hawks, I'm not even high on Tim. I would probably be willing to pay, $448, just because I think that that's a tradable asset in today's NBA. Maybe even like $452, even if a team made me match that. Like, I think $13 million a year for a wing is eminently tradable as long as he doesn't fall off a cliff. But then again, that's what we were saying about Kent Bazemore last year. Yeah,
the argument for signing him, that's a good point for you, is that if you even if you're not in love with Tim, if you think you can get him at a reasonable number and then flip it later, that's reasonable. Especially if you go out and sign Paul Millsap, for instance, and you kind of cap yourself out. You don't want to let the asset go necessarily. Even if I'm not super high on Tim, that if you can get him in that 450 range, that's reasonable enough to where if he doesn't decline, then you could probably get off of it if you really wanted to. My big concern with him is just, he has taken a step forward as sort of a creator, secondary creator, but the shooting has just never matched what people seem to think it is. Yeah. It looks great coming off his hand, but the numbers have never been great. A career 35% shooter is not bad, but when that's pretty much your primary value, it's not great because he's still a bad defender. He's improved, but still not a guy that you want to bank on defensively necessarily. And I think it's at least reasonable that was his best season. I wouldn't bet on that, but I also wouldn't bet against it, if that makes sense.
Oh, I would bet pretty strongly that at least 2 of his 4 seasons on this next contract will be worse than the season he just had in Atlanta. Like that seems
for sure.
pretty reasonable to me. So let's kind of move on here. Do you have any other free agent on the Hawks? Should we talk about Mike Muscala? I feel like he might be the most interesting guy on this list, but is there anyone else that you kind of really hope the Hawks re-sign?
Muscala's really the only guy. I mean, there's some guys who are better than him. Like Ursul Ilyasova is a better player than Muscala, but he has a higher cap hole. Will certainly be in demand around the league. I think Muscala is a guy that's homegrown from the Hawks that was a second round pick that they really like. They've always liked, and he finally sort of started to come around. I think he's a rotation big. You probably don't want him to be more than your 4th big. Probably ideally your 5th big, to be honest. But if you can get him on a reasonable deal, I think that's a guy who they might like, and I know he's a good fit, and that Bud really appreciates his flexibility. I think he's more of a center for me. But he can step out. He can step out and shoot it. He's not the greatest rim protector in the world. He won't kill you there either. He's not the strongest guy, but he's just sort of a nice 4th big role player guy that might be overpaid. I mean, I think about what John Lure got, and that's the sort of the thing that would scare me if I was the Hawks on Mike Muscala, is that you find one team that falls in love with a guy like Muscala. Maybe he ends up getting an 8-figure contract, and I'm not sure I'd pay that, but he'd be a useful, interesting piece moving forward.
Yeah, Muscala seems kind of like a. I don't even think he gets the mid-level, to be honest. I mean, if he gets like $6 million a year, an offer of like $6 million a year from someone, I'm probably okay letting him go, I guess. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It all depends on situation, but I'd be okay if the Hawks paid that, honestly, but I wouldn't be upset if they didn't, if that makes sense. It's pretty reasonable for what he is at his age, and he's not old, but he's not super young either. I mean, Muscala is going to be 26 on July 1st, so you're probably going to get, maybe even if you sign him for 4 years, which you probably wouldn't do, going to get some downside of his ceiling there. So yeah, somewhere in the maybe 317, 318 range would be sort of reasonable, but I wouldn't be upset if I let him go at that number either.
Yeah, I think that's fair. All right, let's move to the NBA draft here. I'm going to save my questions about Dwight Howard for you until the end, because I'm just going to let people sign off before having to deal with talking about Dwight Howard if they choose to do that. So like I said, the Hawks have 19, 31, and 60. Is there anyone that you're particularly eyeing at those picks?
For me, I want upside, and I will defer. I've been trying to watch more draft film. I will always defer to you on draft stuff. But in the same breath, I would like some upside with 19, especially. Last year, they went with the two relatively lower ceiling guys with Prince and Bembry. I like to see him at least take one swing here. Maybe even one a big. I've seen a lot of the Jared Allen, Justin Patton kind of things with 19, and I don't love either of those guys. I don't think you do either in reading your stuff, but. So, somewhere in that range would be a reasonable gamble. Take some, maybe even Hamidou Diallo if he were to be around. Take a swing with one of those picks, and then also if that ends up happening at 19, I would love to see if they would go after one of the more veteran point guards in the 31 range, like a Monte Morris, Frank Mason type, somewhere in there. Just because Malcolm Delaney, who I actually like, wasn't great this year, and they need somebody in that role too. But nobody that I'm in love with. I was actually going to almost flip that around on you and ask you who you think would be a good fit at 19 for the Hawks.
Yeah, I like the idea of kind of instant offense for the Hawks, right? Like, I want someone who can come in and get me buckets either via offensive rebounding or via just being quick as shit and being able to get into the lane whenever he wants. That's two guys for me. I like the idea of John Collins in Atlanta a little bit more than I like the idea of the guys like, Jared Allen, Justin Patton. John Collins is, I believe, younger than Justin Patton. I'm not sure he's younger than Jared Allen. Jared Allen's pretty young for his age, but that was really bad English. Jared Allen is pretty young for his draft or for his high school class, not for his age. So I like the idea of getting a guy who can create his own offense just through sheer hustle and through motor and through energy. I feel like Budenholzer would do really well with that guy. John Collins is a really, really bad defender that I think the Hawks could work with and kind of get him up to speed a little bit quicker. He'd kind of be that developmental guy that, has done so well in these Hawks systems. Even though they have tended to draft a little bit older, I do trust their developmental staff a lot, especially on the wing, but I think that they could also do it with bigs, as we've seen with a guy like a Paul Millsap growing into it, because John Collins has a pretty nice jump shot already for out to 18 feet. If he can extend that back to 3-point range, that would be great. He's one of the most productive rebounders in all of college basketball. He is an incredibly high motor player who just has a nose for the basketball on both ends of the floor, and I think that that's going to play well. If you look at his production by age, he's really the age of a freshman. Like, he is the same age as like Lonzo Ball, De'Aaron Fox. He's younger than Josh Jackson. He's the same age as a lot of those guys in that same ilk. So you look at that production, you put him with a freshman. The only people that have put up his numbers as a freshman, I think, are Kevin Durant, Michael Beasley, and Joe Smith historically. So I really like John Collins as a player there. I also like Juwan Evans because just instant offense. I mean, that guy is quick as hell. He's going to be able to get into the lane. He's elite at creating separation, really good pick and roll point guard. I know that he doesn't really have the positional size that it seems like Atlanta likes to value from its players, but at some stage, you also just need guys who can get buckets, and Juwan Evans can get buckets.
Yeah, Collins is a guy who I think will be better in Atlanta than a lot of places, just because of what you mentioned with the defense. I think Budenholzer's had a lot of success getting, for instance, even Tim Hardaway Jr. in a different role, but they've been able to coax defensive production out of some guys who you wouldn't think they'd be able to. So, as you mentioned, Collins is an awful defender at this point, but he is young, and the Hawks haven't taken in college freshmen since Marvin Williams in the draft. Like, they like to go older, but
it's good. He's a sophomore, so we're
fine. They can at least say that he played 2 years in college. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if they went in that direction. And he's a guy, he definitely would help the offense, and this team does need offense. There's no question about it. I'm still hoping that a guy like Luke Kennard or Donovan Mitchell falls. I doubt it's going to happen, but I'm huge. I know you're big on Kennard as well. But they also need some shooting on this team. There's just not a whole lot of shooting available in this range, I don't think.
Yeah, I like the idea of Kennard there if he would fall that far. Donovan Mitchell's interesting because I think his offense is starting to get a little bit overrated for what it is. He has like some Schroedery wild tendencies on offense as like kind of a pseudo combo guard almost. And I almost feel like his defense is good, but he would also get like out of position pretty regularly. The reason you're drafting Mitchell is for upside, basically. He's not there where I think Atlanta is going to want him to be. The guy that I feel like Atlanta is going to draft is Justin Jackson out of North Carolina.
Yes.
That feels like a very, Atlanta Hawks under Mike Budenholzer pick to me. Just a guy that will knock down shots, that you can work with and get him up to speed pretty quickly. You can put him in Hawks University and he's going to be fine. It's just like, it's one of those funny players that I feel like they would have success with. I also feel like Semi Ojeleye is a guy that would really fit them. I don't know if he's necessarily going to be a guy that they look at 19. I have him at 24 on my board, but I feel like I'm higher than just about everyone else on him at this stage. He is very similar in terms of frame to Paul Millsap in a way. Not super duper long, a little bit bigger than what he will probably play in the NBA at once he gets with strength and conditioning programs for those professional teams. Can shoot the basketball like crazy already. A really, really good instinctive, effort-giving defender who can play both the 3 and the 4. That seems like a fit as well to me in Atlanta.
Yeah, Ojeleye was a guy I'm dreaming about at 31. I mean, it's one of those things where he might not be there, and I think it's almost like 19 seems too high and 31 seems too low, and I really like him as well. So that would be a guy I would certainly not have a problem with. Even 19, I wouldn't be upset if they did that, just because I'm a big fan of his game. But I also, Budenholzer's been he did a little bit more in the playoffs, but he's been a little bit reticent to go with the full small ball 4 revolution. I think Taurean Prince is a guy who could play some 4 down the line, and Bud, I asked about that a couple times, and Bud was not really having it. To be fair, he's a rookie, but I don't think Bud is a huge fan of the small ball revolution in general. But when you have Paul Millsap, it kind of gives you the luxury to not have to worry about that because he can kind of do it all. But in the future, I'm wondering if Bud will actually sort of buy in there.
Yeah. At 31, I'm kind of looking big if I'm Atlanta. We've talked about Mike Muscala leaving via free agency or potentially leaving via free agency. We'll see. This team, like I said at the top, also has Chris Humphreys. Thabo Cephalosha played a little bit of the 4 this year, it seemed like. I'm sorry, I'm missing one as well. Ersan Ilyasova as well, who we discussed a little bit as well. So they could use some big depth. In this draft, one of the things I've been kind of talking about and preaching is that I think the bigs are going to fall in this draft. I think that you're going to see, quite a few really good options at number 31 if I'm Atlanta, sitting there just looking at someone like maybe a Bam Adebayo, a DJ Wilson if he ends up coming out, an Andrzej Pasechnik, guys like that who could, Tyler Lydon as well, Jonathan Motley, Jonathan Jean, I think could eventually get to that spot on draft day. There's just a lot of options there in terms of bigs, and I like the idea of trying to, shore up that depth inside.
Yeah, I wouldn't be upset if they took 2 bigs, honestly. They've invested so much in wings recently that especially if Hardaway Jr. is part of the plan moving forward, you have the 2 rookies from last year, plus Hardaway Jr. and Bazemore. There's only so many spots there. So I would, investing in big men would not be a problem for me, even if they use both picks on front court players. And some of those guys are interesting. What do you think about EK? Is there a chance EK falls? I know that a lot of readers at Peachtree Hoops, where I also do some writing for the Hawks, are suddenly obsessed with him. I honestly don't love him, but I know you've seen more than I have, given that he's out there in LA.
If you want him, I think you're going to have to take him at 19.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, I like him relatively as a project, but like if I was going to take a project big man, I feel like I like him more than some of the other ones, just because he's going to be an interesting, rim protector at 6'9" with a 7'6" wingspan, really good standing reach. Has really good instincts on that end as well. I don't think he's as athletic as some people have portrayed. Kind of a tank body right now. He's already like 255 pounds. He's sitting at, like 5 or 6% body fat, if I remember correctly from the combine. So I think that as a guy that's like 18, 19 years old, you're going to have to worry about him long term, maybe in terms of the way his body develops. You have to really stay on him to, keep in the peak physical condition that he is in right now. If I was the Hawks, I might pass on him, to be honest, just because, he it would be good for him to learn from a guy like Dwight Howard, but I just feel like they can do a little bit better. Because I have EK at number 33 right now. Again, I don't like project big men, I think is the key here. I like him more than some project big men, but I'm just generally not a fan of taking limited players who, like, his upside is probably Clint Capella, I guess, maybe. And I'm not super big on Clint Capella, I guess, either.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And honestly, I was thinking more along the lines of if somebody falls like in that way, like Bam as well, same kind of thing. If they fall at 31 and you're looking at a guy who might be on some boards in the top 22 or 23, then sure, 31, nice value, and go from there. But at 19, I'm kind of with you on that. And I do want upside, but at the same time, you don't just take a guy just to take a guy with some upside. You want to get the best player available. For me, it's best player available still. There's nobody on this roster. We can go back to where we talked about before. There's nobody on this roster for me that's blocking anybody else. Just take the best guy that you think is the best guy.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. If I was picking between Bam and EK, I'm taking Bam, I think, every time, just because with Bam, he at least has game. Like, you can see him, and if you watch him on the AAU circuit, he could occasionally knock down a jumper. He has the ability to put the ball on the ground a little bit at least. His lateral movement and lateral quickness is much stronger than EK's is. He's just generally a better athlete, in my opinion. I know that EK has the length and the size on him, but I just kind of like Bam's overall package a little bit more than what EK brings, I guess.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. I think Bam's a better basketball player at this moment, and that's generally even if it's just a tiebreaker, going with a better basketball player that has more skills is usually probably a safe bet to go with.
Yeah, especially when their age. I believe they're within a year in terms of where they are in terms of age. I'm not. I think it's on the closer side to a year, but I think that they are within a year in terms of where they are with age. All right, Brad. We're going to talk about Dwight Howard real quick.
I feel it.
For people who don't want to hear about Dwight Howard, this is your time. I will understand if you want to go. I liked what Dwight did for the first 82 games, I guess, however many regular season games he played in the regular season. I thought that he was an incredibly underrated defensive player this year. Everyone just kind of wrote him off, I felt like, and maybe it was just like out of sight, out of mind, because Atlanta isn't necessarily a hotbed of, people who talk about basketball all the time. But, I think he was really solid this year, at least, if not, what he was in, Orlando, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, for me, Dwight was exactly what I thought he might be on the higher end. Honestly, I think he was about as good as anybody could have possibly thought he was going to be this year for the Hawks. And with that said, I didn't love the move when it happened. I've said that various times in various places, but in terms of regular season performance, especially early on, I thought he was pretty good. I think he wore down a little bit as the season went along, and some of his numbers tailed off. Not necessarily the rebounding, because he was certainly a good rebounder. He's one of the best rebounders in the league still. But some of the defensive stuff, his mobility really sort of tailed off to me. Saw that in the playoffs as well. And a matchup with, to be fair, the Wizards have two guys that will make you pay in Beal and Wall, and they've kind of exposed him for sort of being statuesque by the end of the year. But in general, Dwight's defensive impact was good, especially around the rim. His rebounding really helped in certain ways. The Howard-Horford debate rages on in Atlanta. I think for me, I think Al Horford's still the better player, but there are things that they're both very different players, so it's kind of tough to gauge them against each other, and that's obviously the comparison that everybody wanted to draw throughout the season. But in general, I think Dwight was pretty good in the playoffs. You saw some of the flaws to having a guy who is as limited, not even necessarily physically, just style of play-wise as Dwight is. He wants the ball in the post. He's not going to get the ball in the post. His exit interview was kind of epic in that he was pretty dismissive and pretty clearly unhappy. Some of that's probably just losing in the playoffs, but I don't think he was too thrilled with his role by the end of the year either. And we all know Dwight's reputation for that kind of stuff. So, in general, his play on the court was fine and probably better than I thought it was going to be. But there's also just the Dwight Howard experience as a whole, which is throws a wrench in things.
Yeah, I think that the biggest problem for Dwight is that he's no longer as active as you would need a limited lateral mobility player to be now. Like, he only contested 5.8 shots per game at the rim this season. That's a pretty low number. That's like LaMarcus Aldridge territory. That is, Giannis territory is like a weak side rim protector. I'm just kind of looking down the list here. Amir Johnson playing 20 minutes per game was right around where Dwight is. He just needed to be a lot more active, and I don't know that he's capable of that anymore. I don't know that he's capable of affecting, a ton of shots at the rim. And if you're not going to be able to affect that many shots at the rim, I just wonder where your utility is going to become playoff time, because while I do think that his overall length and just the presence of Dwight Howard does deter some players in the regular season, there's too many easy ways to kind of exploit that come playoff time.
Well, yeah, you just saw, again, Wall and Beal are sort of extra examples of this, but they were just able to get to wherever they wanted within even 8-10 feet, and Howard was just planted under the rim and sort of unwilling to go out and contest even from 10-12 feet. And, some of that's just, lack of activity is a good way to put it, in that Dwight likes to rebound. He likes to get his numbers in that way. He's still an excellent rebounder, but that's more about, at this point in his career, that's more about him just being extremely strong and extremely smart about positioning. It's not really him being explosive anymore in the way that he used to be. And that, look, he has a ton of minutes, man. Came out of high school. He's only quote unquote 31, but it's a very, very old 31 with his injury, stuff like that. That's not really even me picking on Dwight. It's just that at this point in his career, he needs to probably play less. But him playing less isn't going to go over well with Dwight Howard. You're getting the Dwight Howard personality stuff in it, and I think if you just took all of his past accomplishments out and just used him as a player, he'd be more useful in the way that he could be used at his maximum ability. But he thinks he's still better than he is. And that's the problem when you have a former star that's on the decline, is that they're always going to want the ball more. He wants to be more involved, and having him play a smaller role is just a really, really tough sell, and kind of probably an impossible sell. So the Hawks are in a weird spot, and then he's making a lot of money. He's still useful, but probably needs to be scaled back. It's just whether he's willing and able to do that without just kind of killing the chemistry and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, he's played 36,000 minutes in his NBA career, if you count the playoffs as well in there. That's just so many minutes for a guy that is that size, that is 31 years old. Like, it is, he's not going to be a guy, I feel like, that is hyper effective into his 30s now that we see, the limited athleticism that he still possesses.
Well, yeah, it's the minutes, and then you throw in the back surgeries and the knee problems and and just the banging, and the fact that at his best, everybody's sort of dependent on athleticism to some degree, but I think Dwight, even more than most, he's just a freak athletically. And he still is, when compared to some other centers, is still a pretty good athlete, but he's not the guy that he used to be. And rebounding is the one thing that still translates for Dwight. But aside from that, offensively, for instance, he needs to be a pick and roll player. He's much, much better in that way than he is as a post up guy, but he just doesn't want to put the effort in to go out and do that anymore. And I get that, but in the same breath, offensively, you can't really post him up. His numbers are awful as a post-up guy. So, what does he actually bring you on that end? And he's still good defensively, but if it's that and you're a solidly below-average offensive player, it's kind of a tough combination to have as well.
Yeah, I mean, think about it this way: he's played the same amount of minutes as Tony Parker, and Tony Parker came into the league in 2001. The Spurs have done a great job limiting Parker as much as they can throughout the years, at least. I think it says a lot that Dwight was unable to be limited as much early on in his career, and that probably contributed to the injury issues as well. So, go ahead.
Last thing, if I was the Hawks, I'd be trying to get off of Dwight, to be honest, off the contract, only because I think if anything, he's going to get louder and more vocal that he doesn't like his role. That was my feel. That's not necessarily fully sourced, but it's one of those things where it's pretty clear by the end of the season that he was not thrilled with being sort of relegated to the bench and in fourth quarters, things like that. And I think it's only going to get worse. And it just limits the way that you can build your roster with. He's not making that much money, but $24 million, that's a big cap number for a guy who is so limited. So if I was the Hawks, I'm not sure I'd be willing to give up premium assets, but they don't really have premium assets. So just attach something to get rid of them. That'd be something that I'd be trying to do. I don't know if they're there yet with Dwight, but I would be.
I mean, with 2 years left on the deal, I think you just kind of have to eat it, to be honest.
Maybe. I mean, that's the reason. I mean, there was the Hawks fans that really, really don't like Dwight are talking about stretching him, and it's like, okay, you can't do that. You can't.
It's not worth stretching him.
No, it's too much money, and you don't have a reason to do it. It's not like you have to create this cap space to get. It's just the problem with Dwight is always going to be is it worth it to have him in your locker room if he's going to be a problem in your locker room? We saw it go horribly wrong with Houston 2 years ago, and it didn't ever go horribly wrong in Atlanta to my knowledge, but by the end, like, it was, even outwardly, it was pretty clear that he wasn't thrilled, and if that happens going into a season, like this year, he had the fresh start, the coming home, and all of that, and then still by the end of the year, I think it was pretty clear he wasn't thrilled. So if you do that for another year or two, it might be getting dicey. But yeah, I'm kind of with you that you don't want to attach anything necessarily just to get off of him, but it's sort of right on that fringe where it might be worth it.
Yeah, and by eat it, like, I don't mean release him. I just mean, bite the bullet, keep him for 2 years, and then, either part ways or sign him to a considerably cheaper deal if he really does want to stay in Atlanta. It is what it is with Dwight. You know what I mean? Like, it's just an impossible situation.
For sure. There's no right answer, I don't think, with Dwight. I mean, ideally, he'll just buy into a reduced role. I just have my doubts that that's going to happen, but maybe the Hawks could sweet talk him into it. And he is home; he does like Atlanta, so maybe that's the selling point that they need, and they'll be able to sort of age more gracefully than I think he might be able to.
Yeah. All right, Brad. So let's close it down here. What is your prediction on what happens with Paul Millsap?
I think it's close. I'm actually gonna predict that the Hawks overpay and he stays. I'm not super duper convinced of that, but the public comments, what I've heard, even in back channels around, is that the Hawks have no interest in letting him go, because I think they know that their immediate future is tied to him being on the team. So I think they're going to do everything they can, and if that means they have to give him the 5-year deal that nobody else can give him, and that's what they do. I think that's probably what's going to happen. So maybe if it's not 5,205, but maybe in the 5,180 range, something like that, which is still too much money. But I think he's going to stay with a 5-year contract. That's my final guess.
You think 5 years?
I think he's going to get 5 years, yes, which is, I know that's terrifying and kind of absurd, but that's their one ace in the hole, is that they can offer the 5th year, and I think everybody knows that's a bad idea, but in the same breath, that's their one negotiating ploy. So if the ownership guy, Tony Ressler, the majority owner, comes down and says, and he's been apparently known to do this, there's some reporting on this during the season, that he was the one that squashed the Millsap rumors, so the trade rumors in the middle of the season. If he comes down and says, look, we're paying Paul Millsap, you're going to pay Paul Millsap, and that's going to be the end of that.
That is just so much money to me. I mean,
I'm with you.
I would be willing to go 4 years at his max, and that number is going to be.
It's about 153 for the Hawks. I think his 4 year is like 150 something.
158. Yeah,
there you go. It's a lot of money. Even that's a lot. And honestly, that's probably the best case scenario, I think, for the Hawks, is that they avoid the 5th year, because that's still too much. I think we all know it, but at least you get off the 5th year at like at like 45 million or something in year 5. Just the crazy numbers of that. Just thinking about that as well. But 4 for 158 starts to look great when you compare it to 5,205.
Yeah, I mean, maybe. I don't know, man. It's a lot.
It's so much money. I'm with you all. I've been thinking about this since February. It's been living through my life for a while.
The problem with a deal like that is, for a market like Atlanta, is it hamstrings you so much if he A, gets hurt, or B, takes a dive as he hits 35 years old, to where it's untradeable. You know what I mean?
Even if he doesn't, honestly, just because even if he's just slightly worse than he is now, if you're making $45 million, I mean, there's no way he's going to be more than a quality role player at 36 years old. Can we think? Is that a safe bet to say? I can't imagine him still being a top 50 player at 36.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think he's right now like a top 30 guy. Like, he's probably a top 30 guy in the NBA. Just natural drop off at 36, maybe a top 80 guy. I mean, if things go right.
Right. We saw with Joe Johnson and how quickly the sort of fan base and even the organization soured on that, and he was still an all-star-ish level player the entire time, and that was seen as this massive albatross for the Hawks that they were able to escape from with Brooklyn. But this would be even worse. You have to imagine he's older, and obviously the numbers are just bigger than they used to be.
Yeah, that's a scary contract for me if I'm Atlanta. I think I am offering. I might be willing to go 35 flat. I mean, I think that might be a little bit better, instead of like the $3 million raises each year. Maybe go like to 145 or something like that. Go to 140 million on a 4-year deal. that's at least a little bit more palatable for me than having to worry about him at $41 and $43 million in years 3 and 4. Man, that's tough.
It's so much. And listen, I mean, the one thing about this is that the Hawks could just be shook by the fact that they offered Al Horford the most money last year and he still left.
Yeah.
So if they really want to keep Paul, they might just go overboard. And even if they know it's bad, it might just become this one-track mind. And the way they're talking about it, at least publicly, scares me to death. And that they just keep saying over and over again that he's the number one priority. We want Paul back. We want Paul back. And to some extent, they have to say that because he's their number one player. But at the same time, if you're not willing to set a price and get off of it, then it becomes scary. And that was what they did with Al Horford, and I don't think they loved the result of it because they set the line in the sand with Al and said, we're not going to give you the 5-year max. And he said, okay, I'm leaving. And if they're okay with that, then that's one thing. But if their one track is to keep Paul Millsap at all costs, then that's where you get into trouble.
Yeah. All right. Do they re-sign Tim Hardaway Jr.?
I'm going to say yes. I think even doubly so if they sign Millsap. But even if they don't, I would still lean towards yes. And it will absolutely be a contract that I don't like.
Yes, I would agree with you on both accounts there. Final question here. Give me, or not really a question, but give me one bold prediction for the Hawks this offseason.
Ooh, is it bold to say that they're going to do absolutely nothing and just re-sign everyone? And sort of go against all conventional, because I can't imagine them looking at this team from last year and saying, oh, this team's really good. But I think they're going to literally sign, not everyone, but the 3 guys. I think they're going to. My bold prediction would be they sign Millsap, Hardaway Jr., and Muscala. Add the 2 players at 19 and 31, and just roll with it.
Yeah,
and I will hate that, but that's what that would be my prediction.
Yeah. I think that's probably the safest bet. If you think they re-sign Millsap, it all comes down to what they do with Paul, though.
For sure.
If they are able to keep Paul, then things probably stay the same. If Paul decides to go to Boston or go to Denver or go to, Utah or some random city, Houston, that I'm not thinking of off the top of my head right now, this totally changes. And good God, do I love him in Houston now that you just said that.
That's my one sneaky team. When anybody asks me on radio here in Atlanta where I think I'd be scared about if I was the Hawks trying to keep it, it'd be Houston, because they might have the money, and if you're Paul and you want to win, that might be your best bet, because none of the other teams that are at the top tier really have the money, but Houston actually could create it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. Yeah, I think Boston is in a very similar boat where they might be able to do it if they miss out on Gordon Hayward, but then do you want
to roll back the Millsap?
Yeah, I was going to say, then you're just rolling back Millsap and Horford, and we know how that goes.
I love both those guys. I'm not sure that's going to take you past LeBron, and I don't think you want to sign Paul to a 4-year deal unless you're thinking you're going to be able to get past LeBron. I don't think that's going to do it.
Yeah, that's a fair point. All right, Brad, tell the people where they can find your work. Tell the people where they can listen to your voice.
I write at Uproxx Sports on sort of general NBA stuff. That's the Dime Magazine portion over there, as well as Peachtree Hoops if you're a Hawks person. That's the SB Nation Hawks site where I'm a co-editor, and I also host the Locked On Hawks podcast where I talk about the Hawks usually 5 days a week. In the offseason, it's a little bit less than that, but way too much Hawks talk. So if you enjoy that, do that. And I'm also on Twitter at BT Rowland.
We probably did way too much Hawks talk tonight. Let's be honest here.
It happens, man. I feel for you, and I think you're trying to do all these teams, and there's gonna be some deep dives you have to get into. And the Hawks are not entertaining, but they are sort of interesting in the way that just they have a lot of different things going on this offseason, so it should be fun.
Yeah, I feel like going into this, I was less interested than I came out of it with the Hawks. You know what I mean? Because there are at least a lot of permutations in what they could do, right? It's not like Cleveland where, okay, this is their offseason, they just stand pat. At least the Hawks they have a lot of potential different outcomes, and that's interesting. It's not as interesting to me as Denver, who is a team on the rise and has all of these interesting assets, but they at least exist as they have for the last decade.
That's a great way to put it. They have a lot of things that they could do here. They have 2 draft picks. You're a draft guy. There's at least stuff to think about, even if it's not sexy, quote unquote, but the Hawks, it could be at least interesting, and that's kind of all I can ask for from a team that's not always interesting.
On that note, this has been the Game Theory Podcast. Please remember to rate, review, and subscribe to the show. We will be back on Friday. We're going to do 2 more NBA offseason and draft previews. We're going to kind of talk about, I believe, 2 Western Conference teams. I'm not locked in on which 2 Western Conference teams they're going to be yet, but you can look forward to that. You can look forward to something coming on the aforementioned John Collins on Thursday over at Vice Sports. And you can look forward to an NBA draft big board update over at Sporting News from me on Wednesday morning. I have already filed it over there with those guys. So keep it locked to me on Twitter at Sam_Vicini. Thank you guys for listening. I really appreciate it. Again, it was a very, very successful podcast with Cole Zwicker on Monday. And I really appreciate everyone who takes the time out of their day to listen. So until next time, we will talk soon. Bye.